As we said in the past, anybody who says that he has a sense of that he has a soul, he's totally deluding himself. People believe and experience many things in life based on what they believe. Believe meaning the way they experience things, that touched. How do we know a human being is a composite of the physical and the spiritual? The physical being the physical body, which, as the Torah describes, was made of earth initially. God had formed man of earth. And then the Torah tells us he blew through his nostrils a soul of life. That soul of life is something which is totally spiritual. It's a spiritual component which allowed this physical entity known as body with all its organs, its limbs, to begin functioning and becoming an effective, creative, impactful being, which all existence was created for this particular being. All that exists in existence, the heavens, the celestial, the terrestrial, the endless, unlimited numbers of living beings, living creatures, the fish in the sea, the forest, the vegetation, what the Torah describes, all the different species, was created for this being, this composite called human being. And the Torah describes and tells us what he was and what his objective was: to serve God, to watch the garden, as it says explicitly, to be the caretaker for the garden. And what did it mean to be the caretaker of the garden? God says, you have free reign over this garden. And he creates a woman, a wife, which is made of himself. God had removed an appendage of Adam and created a woman, a wife. So the wife, in terms of the woman, her makeup, her genetic makeup is the same genetic makeup as the man. No difference, except there's a difference in terms of the function, the physicality, but in the totality, it's the same genetics. And the wife was meant to be the helpmate to support and to supplement the areas which the man cannot cover or should not be distracted. That's the story. So how do we know that the human being has a soul, Jew and non-Jew alike? Because the Torah tells us God infused a soul of life into this being. But yet, we find in regard to the animal or other living species, they have life. But that life, the Torah doesn't tell us it's based on that God infused them with anything. God said, let there be a living creature. And it became a living creature. The life source of any other living creature other than the human being is totally physical. It's rooted in the physical, and God infused that physical being with an aspect of physicality that it could function within the capacity of total physicality. Has no relevance outside of its physicality. A human being is something else. There's the physicality of the human being, and then there's this component which gives the physical actions a spiritual edge, a spiritual ramification. That if you use that physical within the context which is prescribed by God, because the soul is functioning within the capacity of the physicality is invested in spirituality. And because the spirituality of the human being is dictated by the soul, and it's only due to his choice, the action of the human being takes that physicality and spiritualizes it. And even though it's made up of something which is physical, You speak about the four base elements: earth, water, wind. These things, they become spiritualized. The Chofetz Chaim writes, what's the law? We're reading now the book of Leviticus, known as the book of Vayikra, Torah Kohanim, the laws which pertain to Kohanim, which are the sacrifices. The Torah speaks about which species qualify for a sacrifice. You have many types of sacrifices. The three species which qualify as sacrifices: the ox, the sheep, and the goat. No other species, and these are all domesticated species, no other species qualifies to be consecrated as a sacrifice, to be brought in the Mishkan or in the, what we call the Beis Hamikdash. Only these are domesticated. In totality, we just read in this past week's reading that 10 kosher species, meaning kosher species is determined because it chews its cud and has split hooves. There are only 10 species. 3 of them are domesticated, and those are the ones which qualify to be brought as a sacrifice. The undomesticated, although they're kosher, because they have both signs which indicate that they're kosher, they chew their cud and they have split hooves, but because they're undomesticated, they do not qualify to be brought in the Mishkan or in the Beis Hamikdash, the temple, as sacrifices. If a person takes this unintelligent creature, which meets the criteria of a kosher species, and consecrates it. So before you consecrate it, it's just a physical entity comprised of bone, meat, sinews, and blood, and has a life source. You could work with it, you could slaughter it, you could consume it. It's up to the person to do whatever he wants with that animal. The moment you consecrate it, meaning you set it aside to go into God's domain, it becomes a holy object. And because it's a holy object, you have no right to utilize it within the capacity of anything unless it's within the capacity of God, which is a sacrifice. So here we have something which is a physical, unintelligible creature. Pre-consecration, it's earthy, mundane, has no element of holiness. But the human being, when he consecrates it, he's able to upgrade it and shift it into another domain, into God's domain. You're able to take something totally physical and give it a spiritual classification because you brought it into God's domain. And now the law is you're not permitted to benefit from it. You benefit from it, it's a Torah violation. Because it has the spiritual characteristic known as through the consecration, it's in God's domain. So the Chofetz Chaim writes, here you have an entity, unintelligible, has no relevance in terms of its essence to anything spiritual. It's totally physical, earthy, but the human being, the Jew, who consecrates it, is able to take that physical entity and elevate it and put it into a classification called the spiritual domain, which gives it a status of holiness, and now qualifies to be used as a sacrifice. So a human being who has a soul, not only does he have a physicality, but he has a component which is the core essence of the human being, which allows him to make choices and to dictate his own life and control his life. If that person takes the physicality which he's endowed with by God, and he takes it and he invests it in God's domain. And how do you invest it in God's domain? By following God's prescription of life. For a Jew, putting on tefillin, observing the Shabbos, observing the festivals, sitting in the sukkah, wearing fringes on the four-cornered garment, keeping dietary laws, believing in God, believing that God took us out of Egypt. These are all positive commandments. A Jew has an obligation twice a day. We mentioned in the third paragraph of the Shema that God took us out of Egypt. That's a positive commandment. Loving God, fearing God, revering God. These are all positive commandments. Studying Torah. All this is within the realm of we have choices. Do we study? Don't we study? It's up to each one of us. Do we want to take that initiative? Don't we want to take the initiative? You prefer to pass on it, you pass on it, but you have an obligation. If you would have taken advantage of that initiative, your mind, your emotion, your essence, we become spiritualized. Because you've taken the physical and you've dedicated, you invested it into the spiritual. As a result of that, you've taken something at a lesser level and infused it through its association with something spiritual, because it's God's dictate, and you elevate it to another level. Now, the text of every bracha we say, when we do a mitzvah, is Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu. Asher Kiddushanu, from the word Kiddush. God has sanctified us and commanded us. Asher Kiddushanu v'tzivanu. He sanctified us and he commanded us to do mitzvah A, B, C, D, whatever the mitzvah may be. So what's the prerequisite that the mitzvah has an effect? First, he sanctified us. We said in the text of the Amidah of the festival, what happened at Sinai? You've chosen us as your people. You loved us, you wanted us, and you've consecrated us with your mitzvos. What does that mean? At Sinai, we became the holy nation. What is the meaning of holiness? What is the source of all kedusha, all holiness? God is the source of all holiness. If you associated and attached to that, automatically you're part of a holy entity. If you have no attachment to it, you're not holy. Because the source of all holiness is where God's presence is. Now, what gives us that connection to be infused with holiness? God says, if you do any one of the 248 positive commandments, which is my dictate, that will sanctify you, because I commanded you to live within that context, to invest your physicality within that context, and the result is a result. What is the result? It's called Kedusha, holiness. And once you're holy, we have a relationship. And because we have a relationship, you become part of my entity, part of my domain. You're elevated to another level. I'll give you an example. Person has a fund, and he raises money for his fund, and the fund is supposed to invest the capital in this particular type of investment. And the one who owns the fund takes the money, uses it for other things. It's called misappropriation. You're not going to use the word embezzlement because he owns the fund, but it's a misappropriation of funds. You have no right. But the fund manager, he can do what he wants. He'll pay the price. There'll be consequences because he violated the agreement of the investors. God is the investor. What's God's investment? He created a creation. And he created a phenomenal creation with an objective. That the human being who has a spiritual core is infused in a physical body. And the person is given control to dictate and dominate that physicality and invest it as he chooses to invest it. You can invest it as mitzivanu, as God commanded you. But yet we have the right, not the right, we have the ability to do as we choose, not to do as God wants. Not only not to do as God wants, you have the ability, even God forbid, to defy God. Because God says yes, I say no. To that degree, that's called defiance. But there's an understanding. You're endowed with a purpose. What's the objective? And God stated that objective very clearly at Sinai. We recognize he's the creator. We have an objective. We are different than all the nations of the world. Every morning when we say the blessing on the Torah, What do we say? You've sanctified us with your mitzvos to engage in Torah study. And then we say another blessing, which you say when a person gets aliyah to Torah, you've chosen us of all nations, and how did you choose of all the nations? You gave us your Torah. That's the second blessing we say on the Torah, and that's the blessing you say when one receives an aliyah. You've chosen us of all the nations. V'nosel is Torah. So what is the Torah? The Torah is God's wisdom. It's the basis for all the spiritualization, for the transformation from the physical to the spiritual. You have a physicality. You can take that physicality, and because we have choice, and invest it differently and misappropriate it. But when you misappropriate it, definitely doesn't have the result of what it was meant for. Not only that, there's a claim against the person. Because you misappropriated something, you have no right to misappropriate. Because God, when he took us out of Egypt, it was very clear at Sinai, as we said, before we were the slaves of Pharaoh, we were his chattels, now God's servants. He redeemed us from Egypt, physical and spiritual redemption for one purpose: to come to Sinai and become his people, to address the objective of creation. That's what the life of a Jew and the value of the Jewish nation is all about. It's not to wage wars. You know, it's interesting. You have nations that have 1 billion people. You have nations that have hundreds of millions of people. The Jewish people were so negligible in number, it's not to be believed. So you say, though, if your purpose is physical, we speak about gross national product. Therefore, your value is physical, so everything is quantified by physical. So therefore, the quantification is based on how many people are part of this particular nation. 1 billion people, 500 million, hundreds of millions, okay. That will determine what the nation's all about. The Jewish people are not, that's not our value. Our value is not our physicality. And God always made it clear to us, never were the Jewish people we were always the smallest nation. We were always a speck on the spectrum, always. Never raised our head in the physical sense above the water. Literally, barely noticeable. Well, what does that say? But if God's people, now let's talk. A person is a king and he has a family. The family is called royalty. The princess. How many princes are there? How many princes are there? If everybody's a prince, the people have no value. They're different echelons. There's the king, it's his family, and then you have the commoners. The Jewish people are known as God's children. Moshe Rabbeinu says to the Jewish people, Children of God's children. How many children does God need? God needs children that reflect who he is. He is spiritual. He endowed us with a spirituality, with an objective to take the physicality and consecrate it through making choices in a life which elevates the physical to give it a spiritual dimension. Although we're physical people, we're made of the same physicality as any other nation. But what is the context of value of that physicality? It's not to go on the golf green and, and use the big Bertha, which Alan knows about, and try to get a hole in one. That's not what it's about. It's not what it's about. You're supposed to have that mind and that focus to understand what God's law and to do things perfectly and meticulously without distraction. And God told us exactly what he wants and how to invest that physicality through spiritual investment. He gave us exact, very specific instructions how to do this. We have a guidebook. The guidebook's called the Torah. But however, man has choice. And time again, man, as we say, shoots himself in his leg. We've had our ups, our downs. We've had our displacements. We've had our Holocaust. We've had our destructions. We had 2 temples. We had many things. But God says, your essence and your value is not your physicality. Therefore, based on statistics, you shouldn't exist. You shouldn't exist, but we do exist. And we all continuously exist as within a certain number. And it's interesting. Our numbers are whittled down to small, and all of a sudden we go back to a certain number, but the number never surpasses a certain number. What do we have? 13, 15 million Jews on the world scene. Never goes above that. During World War II, we whittled down to, we lost 6 million, whittled down to a much lesser number. Again, where are we back to? Not beyond a certain number. Because again, our number is not what we're about. Because our value is not our physicality. That's not what our value is. The nations of the world, their value is their physicality. I once told a story. There's a certain person which I have a very close relationship with, and he asked me this question 30 years ago. He says, does it really make sense? God creates a world, and there are billions of people in the world, and he funds the world, and he continuously wills the world. Is it really worth his while for a handful of tzaddikim, of the value righteous could count, relatively speaking, on one hand? Doesn't make any sense. What does he need it for? It's say if the vast majority or significant minority are special, okay, it's worth it. But if, relatively speaking, you can count those special people on one hand, why is God wasting his time? That's the question he asked me. Okay? So I answered 30 years ago, I gave him this answer. This is what I responded. I said, look, you all have 25,000 employees. They work 3 shifts a day in the different factories and companies you own. Heavy industry. Who are they working for? They work for you. What do you need 25,000 employees? It's you, your wife, and you have 3 children. So the person says, well, if I have 50,000, 100,000, if it's my children, it's worth it all. Because they're doing what I want. They're accommodating me. God created billions of people. They do the heavy lifting. They're a physical people. They deal with the physicality of the world. But God says, my people, you can count them on one finger, 15 million versus billions. They're barely noticeable, but they weren't created to do the heavy lifting. They were meant to take that physicality and invest it in spirituality, to reflect every aspect of my being in this physical world. They're my representation of this world. Therefore, the Jew must keep the Shabbos, because it's a testament to the world that God's the creator. The Jew must behave in a way that it's evident that he's the chosen. When the Jew wears tefillin, the tefillin on his head, God says, and Moshe says in the name of God, when the nations of the world will see the tefillin on your head, of course, it has to be consistent with our behavior. They will revere you. When the nations of the world will see the name of God upon you, they will revere you. Because your whole entity is, even though in the physical we're the same, but we have a different level of being representation. There's an aura. That aura only comes because you've taken that physicality and you've transformed it into what? Its value is spiritual. It's a means, it's not an end. The world, they're physical. As I said, physical, it depends. What are the numbers? 1 billion, hundreds of millions, makes a difference. That's power. The Jew to power, that's not the power of the Jew. Power of the Jew is what? Is his relation with God. As God is infinite, and God dictates, and nothing could oppose God. If we go and we assume his persona, we assume that aura, we become eternal. And we function in a capacity which is beyond limitation. As we're going to read at the end of the book of Vayikra, that if we follow the statutes and we toil for the sake of God, the bounty will be unlimited. Limitation has no relevance whatsoever. But unfortunately, that's not the reality, because we make choices which are not exactly the way God wants us to make those choices. But again, life is choice, free choice. Many years ago, there's a certain woman. She was designed T-shirts, and she was the only daughter of a couple who lived on Park Avenue, and she became a Balas Tshuva. She became observant, and her parents were not happy about it. And we're not talking about she was a teenager; she was a woman already in her late 20s, and she was self-sufficient, but they weren't happy. Okay, and her father had the contract with, I think it was Caterpillar. He sold farm equipment to South America, and he had that franchise. Very wealthy man. He had an only daughter. And she comes to me, and her father had some kind of illness, which was terminal. He wasn't going to recover. And she said to me, I want to go speak to my father. I want to know what could I do for him before he passes away. I said, you should ask him to do two things. Firstly, you should ask him if he never wore tefillin in his life, he should put on a pair of tefillin once. This is his only daughter's request. His only daughter, this is her request. She's not asking anything else. Put on tefillin once before he passes away. Secondly, leave some money for Jewish education. Let him pick which Jewish education. That when he passes away, he should have that merit that he wore tefillin once in his life, and he's leaving money to support Jewish education. She goes to her father. This is an only daughter. A daughter in the material sense, he's proud of her. He tells her, definitely not. I will not put on tefillin. I will not leave money for anything Jewish. That's what he tells his daughter. This is the only request his daughter made of him. Will not do it. So what happens? He dies. So the daughter, being observant, she sat Shiva in her parents' house. I go pay a Shiva visit. She's sitting on a low stool, and her mother's sitting on a chair together with her, keeping her company. And she has two cousins there, grown people older than she was. And they had a son who ultimately became a Baal Tshuva, also through Yad Avram became a lawyer. And the mother says to me, Rabbi, life is choices. My daughter does not be observant. She does not be observant. We weren't observant. Life is choices. She does not be observant. This is what she says to me. And the two cousins chime in. Rabbi, it's true. Life is choices. You don't have to be observant. So I said to them, you're right. Life is choices. You don't have to be observant, but you don't have to choose not to be observant. That's also choice. There's two sides to every coin. Nobody's forcing anybody to be observant. That's your choice. But if a person chooses to be observant, that's his choice. Nobody's imposing anybody's will on anyone to make what choice to make. So you choose to be what you choose to be. That's your choice. And whatever that choice is, you're going to be responsible for that choice. Your daughter chose differently because she has another understanding. And we're not talking she's a child, she's an adult, a successful adult. Therefore, choice that's her value. And therefore, whether you agree with that choice or not, if you tell me life is choices, she has a right to make that choice. And that choice is not infringing on her material life. You'd say by doing that, she's going off the deep end because somehow she's going to become a ward of the state. She'll become a charity case. That's not the case. You're still proud of her. So what's the problem? It's choice. And because it is choice, the Jew is given choice. Either you could go into the oblivion, God forbid, through multiple negative choices, or you could soar to a level where you even surpass the level of an angel. That's within the parameters of a Jew's life. This is the extent of both ends of the spectrum in terms of what we're able to accomplish. But again, the Jew is not meant to be the heavy lifter in the material world. Not meant to be that. And therefore, it's clear our numbers are always kept very small. And it's interesting. We find people, and it's a known fact, Nobel Prize winners per capita of Jews, financial people. The world believes the hundreds of millions of Jews, because wherever you turn, there's a Jew, whether it's in the sciences, whether it's in other areas, financial, Jews are there. They're running the world. No. When you take something which has an unlimited effect and you invest it into limitation, what happens? It could become explosive. It expands at a level which is not comparable. So the Jew's intellect is meant to be invested in Torah, which is infinite, and he invests it in physical, which is finite. What are you investing? You're investing something in energy into something which is limited, which is finite, and you want to put something in there which is an energy level which cannot be contained. What happens? You have something explosive, financially, intellectually, insightful-wise. You see things which other people couldn't come upon, and yet the Jew comes upon. But for a Jew, unless it has that edge, it's for the sake of God. That's called misappropriation. You're misappropriating the endowment. You want to be the doctor and be the observant Jew and be the Kiddush Hashem, to sanctify God's name and to serve humanity as God's servant. It's a whole different story. But if you want to live your life as a physical being and only advance for the material purpose, unrelated to the spiritual, that's not what the Jews are all about. Rambam, who's known as the codifier, the greatest codifier of the earlier commentators, he was the greatest physician in the world, Maimonides. And nobody could actually hold up a candle to his understanding of what medicine was about. And he was known as what? As a devout, learned, scholarly Jew, even among the Egyptians. He lived in Egypt. Abarbanel, at the time of the Spanish Inquisition, he wore multiple hats. At the time of the Inquisition, the expulsion of Jews from Spain, he was the Secretary of State. He was the head of the armed forces. He ran the finances for Ferdinand and Isabella. But who was the Abarbanel? He was one of the leading Torah sages of that generation, of that Spanish, of that generation of Spain. And Ferdinand told him, although I'm expelling the Jews, I'll make you the exception. You could live as a Jew and just continue in the capacity that you're now. He says, no, if you're expelling my brothers, I'm going with them. You could strip me of all my wealth, it's irrelevant. I'm a Jew first, second, and third, I'm out of here. That's the story of Abarbanel with the king and queen of Spain. But again, even the choice within the context that he had chosen was all only connected because he was a Jew. And if he can't display that and impress other people and be the role model, he has no value in that context any longer. Therefore, he's out. And he left with the rest of them. It's a famous story. The Jews were expelled from Spain on Tisha B'Av. During the 9 days, which are days of we mourn the destruction of the first and second temple, a Jew does not listen to music. especially live music. He permitted they should leave with music because the Jews were in such a state of depression. It was bordering on the people having a total meltdown. And he ruled that when they leave Spain, they should leave with a musical accompaniment among themselves, just to keep their spirits up. Didn't make a difference. A Jew gives his life for God, to sanctify his name. Turning your back and all that, that was the ultimate sanctification of God's name. Because you could have stayed and become a Marano. And they did. And those Maranos ultimately eventually either were caught, found out, or they totally assimilated. This is the background. Adam started without a handicap. He wasn't handicapped. By doing something, he created a terminal handicap, and because he's the father of humanity, every human being has that Achilles heel, which Adam introduced into the genetic of the human being. It's called addiction. We're addicted to many things which are contrary to the will of God. Overwhelmingly addicted. And it took them down a bad path. A whole generation was destroyed. The world was destroyed at the time of the great flood. God says, I will not tolerate this any longer. Enough. 10 generations from Adam to Noach, the world is coming to an end. Noach was that special person. Humanity emanates from him and his children. We'll give it another try. Again, 10 generations from Noach to Avram, which we're going to read now. We start studying Pirkei Avos, ethics of our fathers. 10 generations. Avram was born into a world, a pagan world. There wasn't a trace of God's presence. And Avram, being born with a special soul, was able to somehow extract light from darkness. And Avram became the founding father of the Jewish people. And he was able to oppose all those influences and to create an entity, a dynamic which manifested itself that 2 generations later there was Yaakov, which was the most special, most spiritualized patriarch who was qualified to father the Jewish people, the 12 tribes. We went to Egypt. We spent long years there. 50 days after leaving Egypt, we had Sinai. We became the Jewish people. We became the chosen people. But again, as I said, number now is totally irrelevant to us because our value and purpose and function is in the spiritual realm. To take the physical and spiritualize it. That's our function. You know, the Chofetz Chaim explains something with an allegory. We speak about machlokes, people, dissension within communities. It fractionalizes, destroys communities. People, they argue, they have rivalry among themselves. So he gives an example. A king, he has a few sons, and he gives them gifts. And each one is vying to get the larger gift. And they start fighting among themselves. And the king sees this. King has tremendous pain. Tremendous pain. So one of the sons understood what the father was going through, watching his children bickering and fighting. He says, you know something? I'm willing to pass on my portion. I'm not interested. Let them take it, because I don't want to be a part of this aggravation for our father. And he walked away. The king afterwards calls on that son who gave up his portion. He says, you know something? In terms of myself, there's nothing I can't give you. There was no reason to fight. If you would have really related to my honor and my feelings, you would have understood. What I'm able to give is unlimited. And if your brothers would have behaved, I'd give them multiples of what I gave them. And because you chose, due to your sensitivity to me, to walk away, I will give you an endowment way beyond anything these two received. Because ultimately, God is the one who gives them that endowment. We as Jews, what we're supposed to believe, God is the creator, God is the endower, God took us as his people, and we have a purpose and there's an objective, to live within a certain context. You walk that road, you toe that line, and you have those beliefs, and you take the physical and you invest it as God says, the return is unlimited in the physical. Because the value of physical is only to facilitate the spiritual. And God has the ability, as I always say to people, there's no check that God can't write. No check. And he writes the check if you're not going to misappropriate those funds. And many times, even when you do the right thing, what gives value to our choices? Challenge. Despite the challenge, you meet the challenge. That makes your choice even have greater value. The tzaddik doesn't always have it easy. The tzaddik's always low man on the totem pole. Always. And despite that, he's still the tzaddik. And that's why he's a tzaddik. Because his level of dedication, understanding of what life is all about, it's not necessarily a bowl of cherries. That's not what it's about. Life is to do what you're supposed to do. And if you're supposed to do it, you do it. If you're not able to do it, you're not able. The question is, what does it mean you're not able to do it? Everybody has their pain quotient, so to say. Everybody tolerates up to a point. A Jew has to tolerate beyond that point, because we set the bar where we choose to set the bar. But if God sets the bar, God knows exactly where he's setting the bar. It's within the potential, the capability of the person himself. It's like a child who's raised without any study habits. When he becomes an adult, he's going in 6 different directions. But if he's raised by his parents as a child to assume certain responsibilities and to attend, and he develops certain very positive habits, he has a conditioning. Now his life, he invested within those parameters of that conditioning. That's what it's about. We set our own bar. That's the problem. I think this I will do, this I can't do, this I won't do. But God set the bar differently. God says you can do. And if you can do, it's irrelevant where you set the bar. And that's the challenge, but that's choice. Do you look where God sets the bar? Or do you say, I'll set the bar where I choose to set the bar, and that's my choice, lesser rather than more advanced? And that's what it's all about. Every moment in life, which we have, every moment, person lives 80 years, 3 months, so many days, so many hours, so many seconds. Why did you live that amount of time? Life is an endowment. It was given to us for one reason. It has a purpose, because every moment could be utilized and has infinite value. As long as you're alive, that tells you that every moment of my life has that value, and I could still invest it, regardless of what your physical condition is. If a person has his mind, you can fulfill many things just by thought. Your belief in God, your love of God. You're able to speak. You're able to advise. You're able to study. Whatever it is, everything has value. So as long as we're alive and you have the belief, of course, we always have our lenses. We see through colored lenses. I think I've done enough today. Sunday, many years ago, there was a person, he's a brother-in-law, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. His name was Rav Shvadron. Shalom Shvadron, he was known as the Maggid of Jerusalem. And he visited the community in Baltimore, and he sees something unusual. Sunday morning, the first minyan is 8 o'clock or 8:30. And he finds out during the week, there's a 6 o'clock minyan, early minyan. So he says, why is there an early minyan during the week and not Sunday? Because people are not working on Sunday. So they could sleep late. later. She says, why? The same obligation you have to study during the week, you have that same obligation to study on Sunday. If you have the minyan earlier, people will be able to study, do other things later in the day. Then he finds out something interesting. He finds people mowing their own lawns on Sunday. He came in, it was in the spring, summertime. He says, why? Because since we have time, we can mow our lawns. So he says, could you afford to pay for a gardener to mow your lawn? Yes, but if we could do it ourselves, why not? What do you mean, why not? If you're a lawyer and you charge $1,000 an hour, and you can mow your lawn, or you can go earn that kind of money, you spend your time wasting mowing the lawn. He says, the whole thing doesn't make any sense. It's all lopsided. Well, I have all this time available, mow your lawn. But if you see through a different lens, you know what the value of that hour is, or that time. You can invest it in something which has unlimited return. And when he was there for about a month, the whole perspective changed. He had a tremendous influence. They reinstituted Sunday, had the early minyan. People didn't mow their own lawns anymore, many people. They got themselves study partners, and during that time, they would study more on Sunday because they had more time available because they didn't go to work on Sunday. Everything is how you see it, how you process it. But unfortunately, we all get caught up in this, and we all slacken, and we see it, although we're observant, we're committed, but still, the clarity that we have on Yom Kippur, we don't have throughout the year. Less clarity. And there's always upgrading. We can always upgrade. But what happens if, God forbid, God pulls the plug at the age of 90? Once he pulls the plug, whatever opportunity existed prior to that doesn't exist any longer. So now we talk about you're locked in that area, that forever. Is there a chance to make corrections? There are chances. If you had influence on another person's life during your lifetime, a positive influence, and that person beyond your life does good things because you influenced them, those good actions accrue to the person who passed away. We're talking about, long-term investment, postpartum investment. That's what it is. So again, you have to be, we speak about estate planning. When you're alive, you have to do estate planning. Do you leave money for charity? People study, and you're supporting that. You leave what we call a gemach, a loan fund, free loan fund society. And people use your money, and you do chesed beyond your lifetime. All that chesed accrues to you. But that's smart planning. That's estate planning. And all these things we have to think about in advance. People have to advise. Estate planning, you get yourself an expert estate planner, and he advises you. Regarding our spirituality, you have to have estate planning. Because all of us, we could have accomplished more, we didn't, unfortunately. There's always upgrading as long as we're alive, but we're not here forever. So we have to maximize on way here that even beyond our lifetime, we should still get the return on our life's investment. And that's what it's all about. And then this is what is the introduction to resurrection. Person dies, does he come back? And why does he come back? What's the purpose of coming back? This we're going to leave for next week. Just going to leave some time for comments from